Good morning.
Good morning.
So nice to see you this morning. We have a very exciting morning in store for us today with a couple of announcements and a late introduction of Patty Fletcher, who is back there in the corner. She is the managing editor of Creative Nonfiction. Her name has been mentioned a number of times because she will be the person you will be working with near the end of the manuscript experience. And she'll be teaching you, part of the teaching core in Tempe when we get back together in May. So she will be around as you meet this morning with your groups and your partners. She'll be around, she'll be popping her head in if you need to talk to her. She's available all day today and for whatever part of the morning that we have free tomorrow. So whatever kinds of conversations you want to talk about, whatever editing ideas that you need to discuss, or if you just want to kind of talk about your project a little bit more, she's around. The other thing is I promised that I would have a conversation with anyone who's interested in a shorter conversation in book proposals, and there's really not a lot of time to do it today. So anyone interested, and I've received a few emails, we have to be here at 9 tomorrow, so I will come at 8:30 tomorrow. And anybody wants to come early and bring the coffee, of course. Anyone who wants to come early, I'd be happy to talk about book proposals. So 8:30 here tomorrow morning for anybody interested. Yes?
Is there going to be a group activity of any sort in that between 9 and 11? Or is there any reason that we can't meet the people we're mentoring in small pods at a coffee shop somewhere?
Oh, that's an idea. Dave, do you know if there's any evaluation schedule over and above the one from 11 to 12?
I do not think so. I think the group needs to be together at 11. There's narrow windows. They need to be here looking at that needs to be brought.
Okay. Well, in fact, okay, I'll still come here at 8:30 unless all the other groups decide they're not going to show up here. Then I'll change the location and announce it later. Because if you're going to meet somewhere else, I'm not going to push you to walk all the way up there. So 8:30 somewhere. Right now, we will be both word-wise and animal-wise because Virginia Morell will talk to us for the next hour and a half. Animal-wise is the title of her new book, which she probably doesn't want me to mention. Is currently for sale on Amazon for pre-order right now. Last night, a number of us pre-ordered it on Amazon. So it's, she doesn't care whether you buy it or not. I know that. But so animal-wise, the book is really going to be it's a long overdue book, and it really kind of breaks new ground well, here's the subtitle: The Thoughts and Emotions of Our Fellow Creatures. So that's pretty exciting, and we have a chance you can ask her about the way in which the book came together, or anything else. But Virginia has been writing for some of the best science, travel, and science policy magazines in the world, including National Geographic and Science and in travel, Condé Nast Traveler, which is I find quite interesting, and I would like to write for Condé Nast Traveler. You would too, because they send you to so many different places. They pay you a fortune. So this is terrific. So Virginia also has been a great help over the years to creative nonfiction and to the whole genre, and has taught a number of different classes and really understands how to link the scientist, the engineer, the person involved in technology to narrative, and how to make it work from both ends of the spectrum. So I'm really happy. She's a really nice person too, which always makes things great. So I'm really happy and excited to introduce Virginia to you and for you to get to know what she knows, some of the things she knows, and learn more about her and her work. So Virginia Morell.
do I need to, is there a microphone on this? So yesterday I listened to the presentations that were being made on the panel and heard a lot about various ideas of how you guys should be structuring stories or finding story ideas. I wasn't completely sure how much of it you'd actually done yourselves, and so what I thought I would do is just go over a couple of examples of things that I've done and issues that I've encountered when I've been working with different scientists. I thought one that was especially fun as an example of what you want to sort of look out for, at least as someone who's writing and trying to tell stories. And this is a book that I wrote with Richard Leakey a few years ago. It was actually, I was like the ghostwriter in a way because it was a first-person book. First person I was Richard. So, but he was kind enough. He thought because I wrote the book that I should have my name on it. So he's a very generous man. So it's Wildlife Wars, and Richard had tried to write this book himself, and it was a book that covered the years when he was director of the Kenya Wildlife Service, and he had initiated many, many changes in the way that the Wildlife Department ran in Kenya. His first task that he was given was to stop the elephant poaching, which he was able to do by really lobbying hard within Kenya and other East African countries and bringing a proposal together to the CITES organization, which oversees the trade in endangered species. Every time I say the name of that organization, it kind of makes me a little annoyed because you think, why is there any trade in endangered species? You know, how can you even have such an organization? But it does go on. And so Richard went to that CITES meeting and with a number of backers and was able to get this ban enacted. And for several years there wasn't any trade whatsoever in ivory, and the elephant poaching stopped. Then subsequently, after, I don't know exactly which year it began again, but they allowed South Africa and some other countries to begin trading, and now we're at this horrible situation that probably you've seen stories in National Geographic and so forth, of the elephant being very, very nearly on the brink and completely decimated across the continent, which isn't a surprise to any of us who've sort of been following that field. The interesting thing to me that when Richard asked me to help him write his story was that he had tried to tell the story himself. And he brought me his papers, what he had written and what he showed and what he tried to have his agent market and sell. And it started out great. Suddenly, there he is, the director of the museums there in Kenya, National Museums of Kenya. He's a paleoanthropologist. He spends his time out looking for fossils. And gee, one day, the way he tells it in the story, out of the blue, he gets a call from the president of Kenya, President Moy. Well, actually, he didn't even get a phone call. He just heard on the radio that he had suddenly been appointed the head of the Kenya Wildlife Service. Of course, he's amazed and shocked. He's wanted a new challenge in his life, so he's very, very excited and pumped about this. And he goes home and he sees his wife, Neve Leakey, Dr. Neve Leakey, who has been his colleague over all of these years searching for fossils and writing about their fossil discoveries. And Neve is not at all happy about the news. She foresees all of the changes that are going to happen in their lives, plus the danger that this new position will give her husband. And they go to bed there. She's unhappy. He's pumped up. And he's going to take the job. She knows he will. You turn the page. So what do you want to know next? Richard wrote, a few days later, I met with the World Bank. I said, whoa, Richard. I said, I can see why they don't want this book, What happened to me? At this point in the story, no one's thinking elephants, no one's thinking World Bank, And he said, well, that's what happened. And I said, yeah, but Richard, that's not the story. That's not the way you're going to connect people and get them to care about your meeting with the World Bank, which I'm sure was absolutely riveting. So what I did, this is what I did for Richard. So here he is. He's explaining all about me, and she had known that since that I hadn't been happy in my job at the museum and that I was looking for a new and bigger challenge. Being named Kenya's Wildlife Director, however, was not the challenge she had expected, and when I told her my news, I could see that Neve was not pleased. She anticipated the many adjustments my new position would require. I would be highly stressed, and she feared in constant personal danger. Our professional life together, working at the museum or at our field site at Turkana, would change. We didn't talk at length about my new job that first evening, but it was enough for me to realize that if I accepted it, things would not be easy for me. But how could I possibly turn down President Moi's appointment? He'd been president since 1978. He ruled the country on a very direct, hands-on basis. No Kenyan, so far as I knew, had ever said no to a presidential appointment. Were I to do so, there might be repercussions, beginning most likely with my dismissal from the National Museums. Moreover, in all honesty, the appointment was an exciting opportunity. Here was a chance to do something of great importance for my country, to turn around a completely corrupt government department, and before we went to sleep, I made up my mind. I know you're worried about this, I said to me, but I've got to do it. So, Chapter 2. It is a long hour's drive from our home to Nairobi, the first part over a long stretch of dirt road with ruts and loose stones, a very rough track at the best of times, but it also affords grand views. On some mornings after a night's rain, you can see the snowy peaks of Mount Kenya to the north and Mount Kilimanjaro to the south. I'm an early riser and usually leave my home at 5 a.m. I find the drive an excellent time to think. The cool air, spectacular vistas, and deliberate pace help me plan my day. And so then I go on having him talk about what he did. What exactly did he do the next day after getting this appointment? Where did he go? Did he go to the wildlife offices? Did he go to the museum? And so I lead up to, and I finally get to the World Bank meeting. I was amused. I was looking at this last night on page 131. So after I've developed Richard as a character so that you like him, he's not just a mean husband. I explain his position in the country, what his childhood has been like, introduce him as a character so you know he's a Kenyan through and through, give you a history of the elephants, why they're at crisis point, how corrupt the department is, all of that, and then you get to the policy. So that, I think overall that's what you should be looking for in doing kind of narrative journalism that involves policy statements. Is something, that old saying about a spoonful of honey making the medicine go down, it's a little bit like that. No one's going to want to read about the World Bank, I mean, it's just like, and you say the three words, and maybe if you're an economist it gets you excited, but for most of us it's not something exactly riveting. And that's probably true for most policy things. And again, I don't know all of your backgrounds, what areas that you're interested in. I've got to get some more. So then I think most of you looked at a couple of stories that I wrote for Science about wolves. I was trying to think back to how those articles came about, at least the first one. I know how the second one did. But this first one was Wolves at the Door of a More Dangerous World. I write a lot about animals and conservation, partly a result of having done this book with Richard and partly a result of my own life interest in animals and conservation and the fact that we are in the midst of this extinction and that our decisions, what we do almost on a daily basis, affect the other species on this planet, both plants and animals. And especially now that we're at such a point where there are so many of us and the loss of habitat for animals is such a severe problem, it becomes increasingly difficult to know what to say. Because there was a period actually in the 80s and 90s when biologists, as they were calling out for more conservation, more preservation for animals, were taken to task for not worrying about the people who lived close to these areas or in areas where they were trying to conserve animals. And so the biologists, I always found this interesting, but they were forced basically to take into consideration the concerns of people either who lived close to the animals or close to the national parks. So then they had, obviously human interests are always going to take over, they're going to be considered more important than the interests of the animals. So there you have the wildlife manager people who not only have to worry about trying to keep this particular species alive on the planet, but must worry about feeding this poor family's children or providing them medical care. Those kinds of dilemmas have always interested me, and so I've tried to write about art. I tried to pick subjects that allowed me to explore those kinds of issues a little bit. And the one on wolves was especially interesting to me because I do live in the Pacific Northwest. And just in my town, on the outskirts of my town, we have black bear and cougar, and actually cougars come into our city park and kill deer. There was a guy last year who was walking his dog, and there's a cougar has a deer down on the ground, and the deer is quite dead. So, which isn't a bad thing because we're sort of overrun by deer, so it's like, go cougars. Eat the deer that are eating our roses. So, we're pretty used to living with wildlife, and we have now this young wolf, OR7, also known as Journey, who's made his trip down from the eastern corner of Oregon. He's been down hanging around in the mountains close to our home, and then on the other side of California, well, the other side of the Oregon border in California. I would really love to see OR7 set up shop. I think it could take care of our deer problem in no time. But it's not likely to happen because there aren't any female coyote or wolves in the area. And now we've gotten to a point where they've completely taken the wolves off the endangered species list, and they're planning large wolf hunts, trophy hunts in Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. So there goes the population. When I did this particular story, it was still being discussed, whether or not the wolves would be taken off the list. And there was the Earth Justice lawyers in Bozeman, Montana were working hard to present a case to the courts, that the science wasn't adequate, or the way that the population had come back, it still wasn't sufficiently, there weren't enough wolves yet to actually take them off this list. But if you went back in time and looked at what they originally thought, they did think that if they had a few hundred wolves, it would be enough. And what had changed was over the time when they first reintroduced the wolves, up until the point where they said, okay, we're going to take them off the list, the science had changed. And scientists no longer accepted this idea that you could have a population, a viable population of 300 wolves. So this story was a little tricky to put together because you've got the old guard on the one hand saying, but we came up with this plan and this is what we said we were going to do, and we've reached that point. We don't care that the science has changed. And I think that probably policymakers face that dilemma a lot. Now in science, what we do in the journal itself is to present things, articles that are of interest to the scientists. We're told when they do reader surveys that scientists may look through and they'll read various articles, actual scientific reports in the magazine. They read it for their field, but they will read all of the news features because it's sort of a broad shot. It gives them a chance to kind of keep up on everything that's happening. So when you write a story like this, you're not just writing for the biologists or the environmentalists. You know that every scientist who takes science is probably going to read this story. And so you try to present it in a way that it's going to be of interest to just the general reader, and you do all of the things that the other writers were talking about last night, such as not having jargon and finding the simplest, clearest way to present things. Even though you have a very literate audience, you can't presume that they're going to know everything about the field of study. There was one of the former editors, Ellis Rubinstein, he one time took a friend's manuscript. She had written, I think it was Marcia Baranega, and she'd written some genetic story, and she showed me the manuscript later. It was really funny because he sort of circled something at the top. He said, Marcia, remember the physicists And then he circles something a little later on, a little larger. Marcia, remember the physicists. And then like on the back page, it was all X'd out, and he just wrote across it, the physicists! So when we do these stories, you know, even though they, like I said, they're for scientists, they have to be very general and broad. And what was good about you writing it this way was that then at the end, you often wonder, I think, when you're doing these stories, do they have any effect? But what's the impact of a story like this? Does it matter? Well, in this particular case, the lawyer from Earth Justice who was arguing the case on behalf of keeping the wolves on the endangered species list and was saying, yes, the science has changed, and yes, we know more, and this is what we know. He introduced my article as evidence, which was pretty, you know, I'd never had anything like that happen before. And the result was that the judge said this was one of the clearest explanations he read of the problem, and he decided in favor of the wolves, that they would stay on the endangered species list until a better plan was devised, and particularly in the state of Wyoming. That was the big problem, is that 2 states had pretty adequate plans in place, but in the state of Wyoming, the wolves were still listed in a category that was called vermin. And vermin, like, you know, cockroaches, skunks, you name it, the animals we don't love are in that box. And what was shocking to me was the things that people in Wyoming are allowed to do to wolves, including attaching a stick of dynamite to the tail and blowing it up. This is, you know, it's legal to do that in Wyoming. So I remember talking to the wildlife officer there, and I said, you know, he was talking about how difficult it would be because of the attitude of people of Wyoming to get the wolves out of the vermin box. And I said, yeah, but you know, really, I said, I'm in Oregon, and maybe the good people of Wyoming would like to reconsider this, but they haven't. And then with the change, I have to say this was one of the disappointments. As someone who writes a lot about environmental science, it was a disappointment that when President Obama appointed Salazar, that one of the first things he did was to push through the delisting of the wolves. So now, in all 3 states, they are off the endangered species list, and this subsequent story that I did about the research wolves of Yellowstone Kill and Hunt, this is likely to be the news this fall as well, in all 3 states, I can imagine. And what was interesting about this story, this came about a year after my first one, and by then they had allowed Montana and Idaho to go ahead and put in place their state plans. And I had when I was taking notes, I wrote down one comment from Doug Smith, who was the lead scientist on the Wolf Project. And he had said to me, if they go ahead with the hunt and we lose any of our wolves, any of our study population, it will affect our science. And this is NSF-funded science. We have these big government grants, and all this money has been spent to bring the wolves back, and we've got these big grants. We have a project that's like no other. There's no other population of wolves that isn't hunted the way that wolves are usually, like in Canada and Alaska. So we have a very unique opportunity to really understand what wolves' lives are like. And once you have that kind of information, then you can start making policy decisions based on what is best for people and what is best for the animal. And I'll give you an example after I go through how I came up with writing the subsequent piece. So I just had say that in the back of my mind. Doug Smith had said, if we lose a research wolf, it will affect our science. I opened up the New York Times one day, and there was just one of those tiny little stories, 3 lines, something about a wolf, a research wolf, one of the Yellowstone wolves had been killed. I was on the phone the next instant to Doug. Okay, how did it affect your science? We at Science want to know. That is something that scientists will really want to know. What is the effect? You said it would affect research, has it, and in what way? And so that was why, you know, the 2 together make a really good example, I think, for you of what you can do. And even though, you know, I mean, it's not what most of us would hope for, it still shows how stories come about. And I think it's this ability to listen, to pay attention, to be alert to the fact that as people people are talking to you, there's probably another story in there somewhere down the line. And just stay on top of things that are of interest to you. And especially policy stories. I'm going to be coming back to this subject. I'm doing a large story for science this fall about big animals or large carnivores on the landscape, and can we live with them, how do we live with them. And that's where studies like Doug's come into play, because if you have wolves that are allowed to live their lives as wolves did before we decided to kill them all, or before we decided that we're going to take out every punk wolf that kills a lamb, if you allow them to live their lives, they eventually get sort of stable communities. And the older wolves are not going to, because they've lived long enough and they're wise enough, they're not going to run into somebody's caliber and kill those animals. They're going to stick to places where they avoid people. And that's what they've seen now. They're seeing that now with cougar populations in the Pacific Northwest, that the populations where they go in and they keep taking the cats out, those are the ones they have the most trouble with. And there are more encounters with people than the cats that are left alone and allowed to have stable territories. And the cats themselves sort of monitor their own societies. So, but it's hard, you know. I mean, how do you get to that point? Are you going to allow these youngsters to run around and be kind of gang guys for a while until they really get the hang of what they should be doing? So, you know, it's going to take efforts on both parts. But I think that attitude is going along with another attitude that we see coming about in wildlife management, which is that they still talk about it. I mean, even here they talk about harvesting wolves. The animals are like crops. So that attitude also has to change, because they know that taking out the older members of the population, as is always done, is also not good for the animals genetically and not good for them socially. So those are a couple of examples, and then there was another one also for science, and this is another example of where do I get ideas for things. This one, I don't know if you've looked at it yet, I think it's in the box. It's called Killing Whales for Science. Can you believe it? Does it really happen? It does. So I was astonished when I heard that anyone would do such a thing. I was actually out with a dolphin researcher, Lou Herman, and his research team. They've been studying dolphins in captivity, and they've gone over that whole program, and then they had a big humpback whale project going on. And we were sitting there out with humpbacks talking about what a great success story it was, all these whales coming back now to Hawaii. When Lou first started teaching at the University of Hawaii, there weren't any, and then one year somebody called him and said, wow, I think there's a humpback out there in the harbor, and he went out and lo and behold it was, and now there are thousands of them that come every year to have mate and have their young in the waters of Hawaii. So as we were talking about this, he sort of mentioned casually, oh yeah, you know, but you know, there's still some humpback whales. Well, the Japanese, they've got a hunt plan this next year for killing some humpbacks down in the Antarctic. And I was just flabbergasted. How can they possibly do it? They said, well, it's legal, you know, there's a provision in these international treaties that allows countries to go off and take whales for science. And so instantly that became something that we wanted to write about and to cover. How can that be? And what was interesting to me as I was writing this, it ended up that there were just 4 lines in this treaty of the International Whaling Commission, that they put together this treaty back in the 40s. And there was something called Article 8, and it's basically 4 lines. And Article 8 is the reason that the Japanese and Norwegian tourist countries can do so-called scientific whaling, which is, it's just a euphemism for commercial whaling, that they're allowed to get away with it. They can set their own quotas, they can take any species they want, because of these 4 lines in the treaty. And as I was writing the story and finding out about that particular policy, and then as I was writing it up and sending it to my editor, she said, you know what you've done? She said, it's so intriguing that by the time you get to an explanation of what Article 8 is, you're just on pins and needles. You want to know, what the hell is Article 8? So, you know, you can make policy interesting as something that, wow, how is this possible? And What is the reason for it? And then it comes down to these 4 rather boring lines from a document that was written in the 40s. And all these whales must die, alas, because of it. The other thing that I think I brought up briefly last night, you can tell me when to stop. I know it said Q&A, right? Or it was questions only. Or we were joking about it because the way it was written up, it looked like all I was supposed to do was Q&A. But so Lee said, no, it's actually, that there's supposed to be some talk and then Q&A. So let's see. One of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit too were how do you get to character? How do you use character in stories? So I thought I would give an example from the book that I've written, this Animal Wise book. And I'll just read you something here from the beginning of the book. I explain what the book is about in the introduction, and I get to a point where, okay, I've explained the history of the field of animal cognition. And see, if you're most interested in why our human minds are unique, you'll need to read a different book. I went in search of the minds of animals to grasp how the other creatures around us perceive and understand the world. What do they think about? How do we know this? Why does it matter? I don't know if knowing more about animal minds will help improve the lives of humans, although this is usually the rationale scientists, particularly neuroscientists, must use to justify their research. But knowing more about the minds and emotions of other creatures may help us do a better job of sharing the earth with our fellow creatures, and may even open our minds to new ways of perceiving and thinking about our world. We live at a time when far too many species are either going extinct or are in grave danger of doing so. Many species are dying or losing their homes and habitats and the resources they need to survive because of our actions. We are killing many others, from wild fish to elephants, in unsustainable numbers. As these animals disappear, so do their minds. It is a staggering loss, especially when we consider how unique the act of thinking is. We don't yet know of another planet that is as endowed with minds, as endowed with minds as is ours. There may be other planets with life, and such a discovery wouldn't surprise me. But as of now, ours is the only one we know about. Yet only in the last few decades have we seriously attempted to find out what is going on in the minds of our fellow creatures, and we've studied but a mere handful of the many millions of animal minds on our planet. So from there I go to giving people examples of characters, people who study ants. And Nigel Franks studies ants. He discovered in his species they do something like teaching. And he published a paper in Nature about teaching in ants, which outraged everyone. Nigel Franks leaned over a large square petri dish studying the ants roaming around inside. Middle-aged, slightly rumpled, Franks has a full beard, gray and dark hair, and brown eyes, which on this day were framed by clear safety glasses. Like many scientists, he is single-minded in both work and dress, turning up in his ant lab in button-down shirts and khakis with such regularity that students take note. At least one has written a rap song about him. It begins, my name is Nigel R. Franks. I study ants. I hang out in my laboratory and wear it in khaki pants. So I think immediately you like the guy, right? Because like I say, Franks had shared the tune with me because it made him laugh, and also because it contained verses that cleverly summarize some of his key observations about ants, the most important being they're more than the sum of their parts. So he explains that this is a mystical saying, it's the definition of a complex system, and then I talk about how he decodes the ants' decision-making rules, he reduces them to algorithms by his experiments. That sounds all very boring and technical. And then I come to this. Now you'll see what these people do when their home is destroyed, Frank said, looking up from the ants. For an instant, his glasses caught the light and flashed like those of a wrathful god. He reached into the petri dish and deftly removed the top of the ant's nest, which was
simply a house of stacked glass and cardboard slides he built for them. So it's a little sandwich of kind of looking thing about that high. He takes the top off. For the tiny inhabitants, it was as though Jove himself had conjured up a tornado that ripped the roof off their dwelling. Suddenly their home was open to the elements and all sorts of potential disasters, and the inhabitants swarmed about, rushing to rescue their queen and to save their eggs and larvae. Some furiously stroked each other's antennae, while others clustered together like women with children on a sinking ship, and a few scurried off in what looked to me like pure panic. No, Franks said, the people know exactly what to do. They have rules to follow in a crisis like this. I'd only met Franks about an hour before the home wrecking incident. Each time he referred to the ants as people, as he often did, I wondered if he'd gone round the bend. I hesitated, then whispered, they are ants. Without turning his head, Frank said, don't move. Leaning over them like this, we've become their landmarks. These ants don't use chemical trails, they use vertical landmarks. I froze in place, but from the corner of my eye, I could see him smiling. Yes, they are ants. I just do that all the time, call them people, because I don't like thinking of them as machines, as most people do. Most people think ants are stupid too, but they're not. They have very sophisticated behaviors, although they don't have language. And they're very generous in giving up their secrets. A marvelous animal. So that gets you into the story of how the ants come to teach, and the whole debate, which is kind of a policy in a different way, but the whole argument within comparative cognition of what is teaching and why does it matter, and can other animals teach, and how the response. The interesting thing was that there had been this definition out there for 20 years about what teaching was. And nobody could come up with, not even a primate could qualify as a teacher. Nigel took the list of criteria and applied it to his ants and wrote his paper, Teaching in Ants, which Nature then published. So what was the response from the human psychologists? It was to rewrite the definition. That's always what they do. They rewrite, put another block on the wall. And but interestingly enough, there are enough people coming in from the evolutionary biology side who said, that is the wrong response. And what we should be doing here instead is to see which animals have something like teaching. And then we can look at those and we can see in sort of what areas or what evolutionary pressures or what environments something like teaching is going to evolve. And then we have something interesting to talk about. So they looked at the teacher ants, teaching in social bird called babblers, teaching in meerkats, and you begin to see similar kinds of social arrangements, something that would lead to what we think of as teaching. It's not going to be one-to-one identical, but that's the way evolution works. None of our abilities that we have are going to be found exactly like in another animal, but we do. All of our abilities have an evolutionary history to them, and that's what scientists are now trying to get at. And that's really what my new book is about. So I hope that kind of gives you a range of ideas of how you can use both the structure of the story, the subject itself, the characters that you have, the policy that you want to write about, and where do you put that policy. It's not very often that I start with exactly what the subject is about. I try to just give a little bit of sugar in the beginning to make it easy for people to come in, to make them curious. What is Article 8? And we want to get to a point where they want to know what is it, why does it exist, and why are whales being killed because of these 4 lines. So, any questions? Did I talk long enough, Lee?
I think that's a perfect time.
Thank you very much.
And now you have 29.2 minutes for questions. Yes. No, please, ask as many as you need.
Yeah.
So I'm desperately curious, how did you handle the World Bank meeting?
Oh, how did he handle that?
How did you handle the World
Oh,
Bank
how did
meeting?
I handle the World Bank meeting? Oh, I tried to go through it as quickly as I could. But, Richard took he was hostile toward the World Bank. So he wasn't just going to, they wanted to throw money at him, and he felt that the World Bank had done a lot of disservice to Kenya by starting projects and not fulfilling them. and not holding the people that the money was given to account. So the projects would get started, the funds would get stolen, the project would sit there and collect, rainwater, things rusted away. So there were a lot of broken World Bank projects in Kenya, and Richard didn't want to see the new Kenyan Wildlife Service end up like another one. So I have him saying, bold, Richard Leakey kind of provocative things in the meeting. I don't want your money. Stuff like that. Unless I can have it on my
the
turn.
scene that was focused on him?
Well, yes, I mean, it's his book, so, So, when I met again, so he explains his first meeting, he explains his philosophy about, that even though, let's see, when people say that parks are a colonial relic or that national parks are unnatural, my response is to ask, isn't a city unnatural? A cattle dip to protect cows against tick-borne diseases, immunizations, and electricity? By using these things, are we imposing Western values? I don't think any educated Kenyan intends to give up either his trousers or his telephone. Then too, Kenya has experienced a population boom since the 19th century. So then he goes on explaining that he thinks it would be doing great injustice to future generations of Kenya not to do our utmost to protect our parks and reserves. This is his idea that he brings to the World Bank. So when I met again with the World Bank officials, I emphasized that our department's primary focus would be on the protected areas. I gave an estimate of the funding I thought that the Kenya Wildlife Service needed to resolve all the wildlife problems and secure its parks, reserves, and sanctuaries. $300 million to be spent over 10 years. But if you give us this sum, and then it was badly managed, you would be permanently harming Kenya's wildlife and parks, I said. It's not enough to just give the money. It must be wisely spent upon agreed priorities and plans, and the government side must hold firm to the agreed upon policies. Funds should be bound by certain conditions, and there had to be a commitment by the bank to stand behind them. And if KWS, the Wildlife Service, did not meet these commitments or these conditions, then the World Bank should withdraw the funds, which would have been something new and novel, and that didn't happen. He managed to get fired before before all of that took place. Yeah.
I have a question about how you approach writing about scientific studies, and I don't know if that's something that you do because you're writing through longer feature pieces, but you often look at the New York Times and the article that says study finds X, Y, and Z.
I do a lot of that. We have an online. We used to do it all for the magazines for science itself, and they would be in the magazine, but most of that's now moved to the web, to Science Now. So I could write those every day. It's such an appetite.
Right. And so is there, how do you sort of make, if you're writing those, and you're writing those in more of a sort of a reporting news
Yes.
way, have there been times when you saw one of those and felt like you could make it into more of a narrative feature, and how did you go about doing that?
Oh yes, that happens all the time, but usually those particular discoveries, they may be very focused, on one thing. So you write that news story, but then you might want to take a broader approach. And I'm trying to think of, for instance, Irene Pepperberg she had this African gray parrot called Alex, who was rather famous, and I was fortunate to have met Alex while he was still alive. But she still has a lot of research based on Alex, and she had so many thousands of hours of tapes. And she has a new study coming out, something about Alex's ability with numbers that's never been shown with any other animal. And so I'll probably write a short thing for it, but what I realized in talking to her about that study, and that when I go home, I'm going to bring it up with my editor, but it would be interesting to just look back at all of the research that's been done on Alex. What do we know about the minds of birds based on the past studies of Alex and the continuing research that she's drawing on, that she collected and is producing these additional papers. It would be, quite an interesting thing to look at that, what one bird contributed to our understanding of the minds of birds. So, you do see things like that. Or, for instance, when I was working on the wolf story, this whole idea of, we're going to put these large carnivores back on the landscape. how do we get along with them, and can we? Where I live, we have all of the animals that were there when white pioneers first arrived, aside from wolves and grizzly bears. Our community, aside probably from ranchers, most town people, we think the idea of having wolves would be great. We hear coyotes at night, there's foxes all around. The cougars are bad, you never see them, but the mountain away from our valley is called Grizzly Peak, after the last grizzly bear that was killed there sometime in the 19th century. I don't know that anybody really wants to bring grizzly bears back. So those are interesting questions, and that, so one story does lead to the next, and certainly the whales also. I've written so many stories about both the International Whaling Commission and various whale species since doing that one. There's a fellow, Robin Baird, who wants me to join him in Hawaii to look at these unusual species of whales that we know so little about. When you look at a chart of all the whale species in the world, most of us probably think they're like dolphins, and there's the humpbacks and killer whales, and maybe blue whales. You might know something about that. But when you actually look at a chart, there's dozens. They have a huge radiation of different kinds of whales that, gee, I just had no idea. It's almost like seeing the radiation of birds. It's that kind of like flocking of different kinds of animals that live in the ocean, and they come into Hawaii because Hawaii's like an oasis for food and rest and so forth. And so these scientists get glimpses of these animals, but we know so little about them. So, that's what happens, is that one leads to the next to the next. And in fact, Conman's Traveler, I just saw my editor there on Thursday, and they've been doing a series of conservation sort of articles on the rhino and the elephant and so forth. And I said, well, you ought to do a positive one. It was sad. Do a positive one about the whales. So he wants me to look at, get him a short paragraph about that. And also, he's keen to have one about the polar bears too, which is another sad story. Yes.
Oh, I have two questions. The first one, I've been hearing a lot about kind of cultural transmission and orangutans. Is that in your book as well? Is it the same thing as teaching, or is it considered?
No, cultural transmission is different. Animals do have culture. A lot of animals do have cultures, but they learn a lot as we learn a lot just by watching. And teaching is something that's different.
Okay.
Teaching is a cost to yourself.
Okay.
And,
Yeah.
exactly. He knows. Spoken as a teacher. That's a big thing. The first number one part. There's a cost to you as an individual. So.
That's great. I can't wait to read your book. But so the second part. So I did I worked for my college magazine, like they were also a great experience. And now I'm in the sort of online study write-up space. I'd love to. I'd love to jump more to conservation. I have like a kind of social science background and a lot of policy stuff. I wonder about the specifics of kind of maybe jumping to conservation. You said yesterday, or to write a book and then do articles about it. I just wonder, how do you get into that? What's that? How to make the jump? Just try and sort of gradually move in that direction by covering, studies about.
That's what I did. My own degrees are. I do have a Master of Science in Environmental Science, but my degrees really are in English Lit, and that was, growing up, that's what I did. I read and I wrote, and I think when Lee and other people talk about, the importance of reading, what reading teaches you is how to structure a story. And so it's important to read all the great novelists because they know how to tell a story. And you can learn a lot about pacing, especially. Pacing is so important, withholding of information. I don't come right out at the beginning of the whale story and start talking about Article 8. I would be like, oh, it'd be so boring. Or, for instance, like what I did for Richard wasn't that we're going to go to the World Bank immediately. We're going to pace things, use the information gradually, set a scene, develop your characters, make people care, and then you introduce the policy. And I think, if you want to write about a particular subject, you just start trying to write about it and get things published that way. That's what I did. I was keen to write about environmental stuff, and so I just, whenever I had the opportunity to write anything that was small, then I would do so. When I was first asked, I mean, it was interesting. I was doing science writing, trying to get into magazines and so forth, and I got this very nice offer to write a biography about the Leakey family from Simon & Schuster, and so that, the interesting thing about doing that, taking on a project of that size, was that then magazine editors knew about it. And even though it wasn't done because it was a long project, it took me about 10 years to do the thing, they treated me like I was a different writer than I had been before I signed the contract. I wasn't done. But nevertheless, they perceived me as a different caliber of writer. And it became easier to get assignments, to be taken seriously, and to write about a range of things that I was interested in. And I mean, when I first started writing for science, anything that they asked me to write, I wrote. So one of the first stories was about the Oregon healthcare plan. And I remember thinking, oh God, so not what I'm interested in. But, you never say that. It's like, great idea. And actually, it turned out to be a really interesting story, and I enjoyed doing it. And then I found that, science is a weekly, and now with the daily news stuff, it's almost a daily. They have great demand for things, and looking, reading, you always want to be familiar with the magazine you're working for, and so I read through just briefly some of the articles they publish. You could see very clearly, because I started writing for them in the late 80s, I guess it was in early 90s, and it was very clear that genetics was by far the largest subject that they covered. So I said to my editor one day, I really ought to get up to speed on genetics, so can you pass something small my way? I'm interested in giving it a try. I said, all right. So the next week he called me and he said, we're publishing a major paper next week on the discovery of the Huntington's disease gene, and we'd like you to write the news feature that accompanies that. I said, you have to be kidding. Like, that's not small. he said, that's all right, we know you can do it. I thought, you may think so. But so I remember going to the university library and bookstore in our town and buying these books on molecular biology and like cramming before I was going to interview people. Francis Collins, my God, how could I talk to him if I didn't even know the vocabulary? So I crammed and I was reading all these words and trying to remember, okay, that's a real word in their vocabulary. Even if I don't know what it means when he says it, at least I'll know that that's like a word. I know it probably sounds scary to anybody who's a real scientist here. But the thing about the English language or writers is that the words may change, but story structure, sentences stay the same. So, you can plug in the words. And so anyway, I did the story, and there was a really excellent genetics editor there who helped me through the rough parts, and I got it through it and did it, so now I can write about genetics. But wow, there were times, I remember calling John at one point and saying, I am just thinking here. He said, no, you're doing it. Easy for you to say. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about how you develop relationships with the scientists. Like, for instance, in your two Wolf pieces,
Yeah.
Doug Smith is a big character.
Yes.
And so, and then you have an opposing character whose name
Ed Bangs.
Ed Bangs, thank you.
Very interesting, Ed Bangs.
Yeah, and at one point he even says, the wolves really aren't getting shot that much. Everyone's making a big deal just because of one of Doug Smith's wolves.
Yeah.
So how do you develop these relationships with the scientists? How do you identify what scientists are kind of going to become your linchpins and your characters? And is there any tension when they become a character as opposed to just a source?
Well, I always try to make them aware of the fact that they are a source and they may be a character in my story. But one thing that we do at Science, or most of us do, I've heard some occasions people don't do this, but I always do it because I like to maintain good relationships with people, is that we do our own fact-checking. And that means that every single quote in these stories, I have called the person back and read it to them. So they know exactly what they're going to sound like. And if they don't like it, they better change it now. And we don't have a policy. I mean, you know, and then I tell them there are certain things that they're not allowed to change, you know, but if it's factual, we will correct it. But I make a point of saying, you know, this is what you sound like. And if you want to make a big fuss about it, tell me now. So that, in fact, I've had people, I remember this one article I did about the pollock fisheries that were really heading down in Alaska. And so I talked to a fisherwoman at one of the fishing associations and had a quote from her. And I called her back, and she said, she was astonished. She said, well, I've never had an experience like this. No reporter has ever called me back. She said, even if I didn't like what you are quoting me saying, I'm going to let you use it because you called me back. So, you know, you made this effort to find me and read this to me, so I'm not going to be embarrassed. I know what it's saying. Now, Ed Bangs was such an interesting character. He was real sly and tried to, I don't know exactly what it is, you know, there's always chemistry, men and women, but Ed thought he was a ladies' man. Even on the telephone, I could tell that. And so he was sort of sweet-talking me all the time. This guy even sent me poetry, Whitman. I thought, you know, Bill Clinton tried that with Monica. Yeah. What is with this character? And I thought, yeah, what a man. So, but, you know, even Ed stuck by his quotes. And so the second time, but he was a little miffed, I could tell people that, you know, he got some heat from folks and for some of his comments. I think that my favorite one was how you can have connectivity with a wolf in the back of a truck, you know. You can still have connectivity. You know. So he stood by it. He said, yeah, you know, I said that. But when I interviewed him for the next time around, he said, what is this going to be, another Ed versus Doug story? I said, well, probably something like that. But you know, you do develop relationships, and the scientists, one time I was told by this young fellow I quoted in a story about ancient DNA, and he had come up with not only a way to extract DNA from insects that were stuck in numbers, but he had a really great project and could explain beautifully why this was important research to do and what it could tell you about how animals have changed in time. It was such a great quote, you know, I just wanted to hug him. And so I put the whole thing in the story. He was a postdoc, and his advisor said to him afterwards, he said, gee, Brian, you know, like getting an article, a research article published in Science on a scale of 1 to 10 is like maybe a 7 or an 8, but a quote like this in Science, that's a 10. So that really brought home the fact that for them, anyone in the scientific field being quoted in the stories, it's really important to their careers. So it's a two-way street, and they want to be quoted, they don't want to be, they want it to be accurate, they want their research, of course, presented accurately. That's like key. So I go out of my way to make them feel ease about all of those things. And so I like to think of all of these people as friends. I mean, Doug, he was worried about his position. He's a man who lives in those communities. Regularly, he gets threats from people who want to kill him because of what his research on behalf of the wolves. So he's in a very delicate position. You know, we try to be somewhat sympathetic to that. I don't know if that answers your question.
You mentioned briefly that when you call these scientists back to double check on their quotes, you'll sometimes say that there are things that you can't change or aren't willing to change.
Yeah.
Are you speaking specifically about something that they said, or the way that they said it, or both?
Both. Sometimes they'll want to correct their English so that they sound like a textbook.
Right.
I'm just like, well, you know what? That if you want me to put that in here, you're going to cut.
Right.
You have to sound like a talking person, not a textbook. One of my favorites was, and he didn't ask for his quote to be cut, but I heard afterwards that people made it into a button, something quoted in Science. And he said, I called him up and was talking to him about this other researcher's study on a molecular clock idea that I had and how it worked or something. So I called this fellow up and I said I was writing a news story about this guy's study of this molecular clock, and I hear on the other end, an out-and-out raspberry. And I said, oh, I gather you don't think much of his work. He said, no, it's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It's trash, you know, something like that. So I put all of that in.
curious, I mean, you mentioned the wolf story, and a lot of these stories, it sounds like there's a lot of politics in them. And
Conservation is like that.
yeah, and particularly, it's interesting, I used to actually live in Jackson and work close to Yellowstone at the National Refuge, and like saw all these politics firsthand, and talked a lot with the scientists, and they all get, like, getting to know them, like the scientists working, it's like, it's clear that they are trying to do good science, but they also have a personal agenda, which, I mean, I'm not trying to say that there's one or the other that, that's always what drives science is someone's personal agenda, but that's certainly a part of who these people are. And how do you sort of deal with that issue versus teasing out the science for a journal or for a news feature in science that obviously just wants to, not be seen as politicized? How do you sort of separate those two?
Well, it's a tricky thing to do, and you're not trying to present a political agenda as such, but our job when we write for science is, are we going to be biased in favor of the science? Duh, yes, we are, So if a man loses his research subjects because some hunter comes out and blasts the animal away, and that spoils his NSF-funded project, are we going to say more or less, between the lines, that this is a shocking thing to have happened? Every scientist in the world would put himself in that man's place. And the same, when there was a researcher, a botanist who had these, they weren't even genetically modified plants. He just done back crosses. He was doing all these different back crosses, and he had a whole range of these monkey flowers that he was working on. And some young environmental-minded kids went in and torched the lab, burned them all down. Oh, years and years of research up in flames. Well, we don't come down on the side of the people who blew that lab up, that's for sure. Say what you will about GMO. It wasn't even that. It was like, if you're going to do those kinds of attacks, at least know your target. Somebody's doing back crosses on plants. That is genetic engineering. We just don't happen to call it that, but it is what it is. But, that's one of the advantages of writing these pieces for science, is that we can be in favor of the science. It's actually somewhat freeing to have that ability, where you don't have to think about all the extraneous social. You can raise those issues, but I think we will always come down in a little bit on the side of the science. We'll be sympathetic to other points of view, but if it's affecting the science, just like I said, when I read that piece that he had lost his wolf and that he had said that it would affect his study, then we want to know how. And these things are of great concern to scientists. They're trying to do various studies all around the world. We're in a time of lots of social, cultural tensions. Some places, such as I've done articles about Native American tribes and how they don't want their artifacts handled. There's places in Australia where all the artifacts are taken and scattered back over the landscape. And you try to be, you are sympathetic to that, and at the same time, what is the cost to the science? So. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a difficult thing. I obviously struggle with these questions myself. Don't always come up with the right answer, probably seldom. Yeah, okay.
So actually I want to take you back to the World Bank. And,
Okay.
let me just sort of preface you with this, the disclaimer that I understand I'm sort of atypical in this respect, and also that, this wouldn't fit in a book that's about leaky and sort of told through his perspective. But, in a lot of respects, I think that the World Bank actually interests me a lot more than the scenery on the drive to Nairobi. And, what I'm wondering about is sort of the way that you sort of structure the Ed versus Bruce exchange, and the way that you talk about, it sounds at least like you talk about leaky in the World Bank, is sort of this, the literary advice there is like, this is sort of a clash of two different people, and, one of them is sort of going to be given a little bit more preference than the other. What I'm wondering about is, how do you get things, it seems to me that the World Bank exchange actually encompasses a lot more than that. There's a lot of sort of nuance and politics that sort of is taking place behind the scenes, So what is the World Bank doing in Kenya? Why is it that this is a project that they want to devote resources to? Why should they trust this guy to begin with? What kinds of considerations are factoring into their decision to sort of fund this preservation agency in a serious way? So what I guess I'm wondering is what kind of a literary advice would you use to get at those kinds of
Same thing, scene and dialogue and So Richard has to, you know, his service is busted. They don't have any money when he takes over. They don't even have money for petrol, as they call it in Kenya, to put into the cars, their vehicles. The vehicles don't even have tires, nothing. So he's taken around, they were supposed to have, he sees on the list of materials there that, let's see if I can get to this point. Yeah, so he finds out, he goes down through the list of equipment that the parks are supposed to have. The headquarters, parks headquarters and parks themselves were graveyards of equipment. I'd seen them for myself. The Department of Wildlife supposedly had 11 airplanes, but only one was capable of daily flights. I spotted one of the other planes in the hangar at Wilson Airport. It looked fine, except that its engine was missing. What happened to the engine? I asked an attendant. He replied with a shrug, it got lost. I stared at the man. You can't lose engines from airplanes. Well, sir, it is lost. The engine never did turn up. My predecessor had struggled with the same problem. Among his papers, I found a report indicating that out of 574 cars, trucks, vans, tractors, and other vehicles owned by the department, barely 5% were so-called battle-worthy. None was roadworthy. They wouldn't have passed the police department's road test. How could the Rangers be expected to stop the poachers without the tools for the job? So he says all of this has got to change. And he discovers that the problem is that the department has not paid its bills in several years. So on my third day in office, I met with the directors of all the major oil companies in Nairobi, Shell, Esso, Caltex, Agit, and Mobil. I didn't waste words. We have a terrible problem with poaching in our country. As you know, we've got to stop it and get our parks working, or it will be the end of our economy. My men can't get into the field without fuel. I then asked for an immediate supply of 250,000 liters of gasoline and diesel, and a grace period of 2 months' time to pay the bill. The gentlemen were polite, but they shook their heads. The government departments, including wildlife, already owed their companies so much money that I couldn't be expected to get a single liter of fuel on credit. I tried another tactic. Would they give me, personally, 2 months' credit for the 250,000 liters of fuel? It was an audacious, even desperate request, and to my surprise, they agreed this could be arranged. I signed the papers for what amounted to a bill of $100,000, for which I alone was responsible. I used the same approach with Cooper Motors, the supplier of Land Rovers in Kenya. Its CEO said he couldn't make a credit arrangement with the wildlife department, but he was willing to give me $500,000 in credit, payable over 12 months. I immediately signed the papers, exchanging the $500,000 for 18 new vehicles. To the CEO's credit, the loan was interest-free. So everything starts getting a little bit back on track, and then he's received a memo from the permanent secretary, who's kind of like almost second to the president in Kenya, announcing that they are going to handle a sale of ivory stocks. And Richard sort of put it on hold for a little bit. But after getting all this, fuel in cars, he's feeling a little boost of energy. So he thinks back to the memo about the ivory sale. Perhaps it contained clues to what extent the Rangers and government officials were involved in this poaching. I contacted the permanent secretary again. I'm ready for your meeting, I told him. Let's open the bids. He wants to know who's bidding on that ivory, who's got their hands in the pot. Basically what he wants to find out. So that's what you do.
Okay.
Does that help? I mean, all the way through, obviously, before I get to page 131, I've explained a lot about what's going on in Kenya, the scale of the problem, Richard's role, why he's respected, why these businesses would choose to loan him personally this money, because of his reputation and who he is and so forth. He's able to do that and is willing to do it for the sake of his country.
Okay.
So there's a lot more before page.
I'm sure.
So the ivory meeting was a real fun one too, because Richard's very suspicious. It's already obviously it's a done deal. There's like one bidder, and there's a suspicion on Richard's part that probably more ivory is actually being given to this one Asian gentleman than is is actually, you know, the amount of the sail, the weight of the ivory is somewhat less than actually what the guy's getting. That's a lot more. So they decide to withdraw the sail, and then Richard thinks of the moment when Bridget Bardot burned all of these coats that were made out of the pelts of leopards and cheetahs and so forth. She did this big statement once in Paris, and he thinks back to this one night, and he decided, that's what I'm going to do with that ivory, I'm going to burn it. And me says, you know, well, that would be spectacular, but does ivory burn? So then they, through a friend, they find a Hollywood special effects guy who said, yeah, I can get that to burn. And I won't blow up your president. He said that because they wanted President Moy to torch the pile. You know, so they paint this special stuff on the tusks, which creates a spectacular blaze and doesn't blow up President Moy. That was sort of the end of the agribushing for a while. So, you know, I mean, that's the thing, is that I'm just giving you snippets, but your questions that you ask are really good ones, and they're questions that I had, and then, you know, you find ways, and it's mostly through scene and in a book like this, dialogue, and then explanations, you know, and I go into the history of the World Bank's relationship in Kenya, and these dead-ended projects that Richard keeps encountering in the national parks, you know.
But it's all told in the context of story.
Yes, it's always, yeah. He's out in the field, he's taking to see something, and, you know. So yeah, it's always the story. Keep the story moving, and you're dispensing information as you go along, holding stuff back, because that's what keeps people holding to the story. And you don't want to show them your whole hand. You want them to get to the last page, last sentence. I wonder what happens next. Anything else? Anything you'd like me to cover later?
What do you guys think? Do you have more questions? If not,
Actually,
we'll
there
take a
is.
break.
She does. I had a question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I know.
So I guess my question relates to something we were discussing the other day, which as scholars and as communicators in this room, we were talking about the process of research and the process of writing, and how sometimes in our writing, that's when we discover what we're writing about, what our point is.
That's true.
And so I guess my question, just taking a step back from that, is as a researcher, I spend a lot of time following scientists around and watching what they do, and I get so wrapped up in what they do that I want to keep doing it. And so the question for me is always, when do I cut the research off? How do I know my research is done and I should start writing? And related to that, once I start writing, how do I know the piece is ready for prime time? Like, how do I know it's ready to go out there? How do I know it's done? So for you, I'm just wondering, how do you know when your research is done, when you're ready to write? And how do you know when your writing is done? And then do you ever have this thing where something's out there and you're like, oh, but I wish I had said this, or I wish I did.
Well, you always have that. You know, if you're a writer, you always want to have yet another last word. But usually for the pieces for science in particular, a really good thing about writing for a magazine like that is that they have these things called deadlines. And they're really serious. And you've got a hole in the magazine, you know, the issue's being laid out, you're told you have 2.5 pages, so that translates to X number of words, and the clock is ticking. So you've got to get your research done, you've got to get that story written, you've got to get it fact-checked, because that's your job too, and you have to meet that deadline. So immediately, you begin mentally pruning, you know. Interesting, but can't use it. That's cool, but so you're heartless. Slash and burn, I call it. And you keep the stuff that you know is going to move the story forward and that you really have to get in. And even then, you know, there will be times where there'll be a phrase or a quote from somebody, and, you know, that you lose a few things. And your editor says, yeah, I know, I really hated to lose that too, but, you know, we've got to close this up and move on to the next thing. So that's the way that it works. And you do it because that's your job. And you know, if I ever had missed a deadline for science, I would not be writing for them now. It's that serious. I know a lot of people in academics, scientists will say to me, my goodness, you know, how can you possibly write? I've been working on this field of study for X number of months, or years, or whatever. How can you possibly write that in that amount of time? I said, I don't you just do it. You sit down and you stick with it and you get it done. And it's, for me, it's like kind of like a mental puzzle, you know, where do all the pieces go, and it's, when things click and you really see how they work together, it's a nice feeling, and it's a lot of fun. I like deadline work.
Do you see a similar process with book projects? You have sort of deadlines?
Oh, you have deadlines, yes, you have deadlines, and those are the ones that just give you stomach aches at night. In science, I can turn those, I'm fairly confident, you know, I get an assignment on a Monday, and they want the story by Wednesday or Thursday, you know, and I'm pretty sure I can do that, but the book was, especially the last one, was more of a challenge than I'd expected. There were a couple of different reasons for that. One was that the editor who first signed the book contract at Crown and was a real champion for the book, she had some personal crisis and left partway through, so I didn't have an editor, and I found it very disheartening to be writing and sending things in and nothing, no response, no reaction. And so then I eventually did get another editor, John Busman, who was fabulous and quite wonderful. And he read through my first draft and made some good suggestions. And one of his best was that I had worked very hard on making the animals in the chapters characters. And he said, what you need to do now is to do the same thing for the scientists, because he said, and it's a really good point. He said, the way that people are going to fall in love with the animals is if they fall in love with the scientists. If they like the scientists, then they're going to like the animals. It was really a smart observation. But it meant, oh my God, you know, easy for him to say. He said, oh, it'll be fun, you could put all these cool things in about your researchers. But wow, it is a lot of work to write profiles and to create the kind of tension. You know, it was really taking each chapter and making it into like a short story. So I started on that, and then John left to become head of editor of Norton, which is good for him, but not so great for me. And then there was another woman after another couple-month hiatus. A year ago, August, Vanessa Mobley took over, and she wrote me this splendid letter and told me how much everyone there loved the book and we were, you know, really behind it, and she had some good ideas. And then I knew I had about a year to finish, to really go back through it. And it took me approximately a year longer, and I think part to write, to do it, to meet, you know, they kept extending the deadline. They loved, when I turned in the revised introduction, which took me several months to do, they were very high on the book at that point, and they sort of allowed me. But I, you know, mentally, for myself, I was under constant pressure. There wasn't a day or night that I wasn't thinking about that book. And quite honestly, I don't like living like that. So, I'm not sure how the next one, I kind of think the next one I would like to write more on my terms. There was a lot of money attached to the contract, so there was I knew that if I didn't get the book done, I was going to have to pay them back a lot of money, and there was just a lot of tension to it, and I honestly would prefer not, like I said, not to do something like that again. I want to do another book, but just without that extra level of tension.
How long did the total process take about?
Well, it's always hard to say because, you know, I mean, I was also writing things for science. I'm a correspondent for science. I have to maintain that. I owe them so many stories a year, and I have to, you know, contribute. So, and then coming as Traveler had me writing a couple of things, and you want to kind of keep active that way. But I would say, you know, full-out flat writing was a couple of years. But I had to go off and do the research, and I had to find scientists. I was looking for people like the ant teacher, the guy who had with his ants, who had found out unusual, interesting things about animals. I wasn't looking for your, every Jane Goodall, every expected animal researcher. I was looking for people who weren't well-known, but who were doing cutting-edge research. So it takes time to find it. I never had the problem that Mike Rosen, what he talked about last night, where the scientist said, I don't understand why you want to write about me, don't come. I never had that problem. It was always, the only problem I had in that respect was when Karen McComb with her elephants said that I could come all the way down to Sully to see her and to see her project with the elephants, but she could give me 2 days of her time. It's like, oh, that's a challenge, but I did it. I took it, you know, I said, okay, I'll be there. I did it, and it turned out to be a great chapter. So I should let Lee take over here. I have to share the last thing. Somebody asked me, are you going to bring your dog? Yes.